Yeah, pleasure to talk to you all today. And I just thought I'd share some thoughts on really where we as myenergi see the energy ecosystem going, and how electric vehicles for us are very much kind of the gateway drug, as we call it. So really the starting point for many consumers will be the journey into electric vehicles, and that will then sort of send them in the direction of wider decarbonisation and energy savings within their home. So a little bit about us first, if I may. I'm fairly new to myenergi. I'm about 8 weeks in. I was previously in the EV charging ecosystem before that. So myenergi, for those of you that haven't heard of us before, we're an eco-smart technology company. So we make various products that can help you control energy around your home using it in a very super smart way. I won't go into the detail of all those products right now. It's not a sales pitch. You can do that if you wish. So we have three core products: the Eddy, the Zappy, and the Harvey. We like to end things with the letter I, just to prove how intelligent they are. And those products are what we make in the UK at the moment. So these are all UK-made products up in our facility close to Grimsby. We're a relatively new company, so we started life in 2016, made our first products in 2017, and really it's been a real roller coaster of a ride over the last few years. Massive growth. Started as a business with just a few people. We now employ more than 350 in the UK. So we have a very large footprint here and a rapidly growing. Obviously, it's growth of the decarbonisation and energy EV sectors is continuing at pace. So we started life in a building in a little village called Binbrook in North Lincolnshire. That was the team just a couple of years ago, sort of 3 years ago, about 20 or so people in total. Charlie Borman is not employed by us, but he did come for a visit on his electric motorcycle there. And we are now moving forward into a new world. So our new facility, a new head office, is the building on the left of this artist impression. That's already been built. Obviously, solar panels on the roof, etc. Fantastic new space again up in a place called Salimborough, and the building to the north, to the sort of the north of the picture, as it were, the top of the picture, will be our new 50,000 square foot manufacturing facility. We already manufacture down the road, but we're bringing it all onto one site. So that will be our new footprint from a small industrial unit in Binbrook to this in just a few years. So it just shows the pace of the industry, really. In terms of market context, when it comes to electric vehicles, I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you that the market is absolutely booming, and that's despite what you might have seen in the media in recent days about things like the withdrawal of the government grant. It was really designed as an early incentive in the electric vehicle market in the UK. It wasn't designed to support a mass market of electric vehicles, mass adoption. It was there to stimulate the early market, which is exactly what it's done. We're seeing rapid growth of electric vehicles now, and I personally would argue that the grant has done its job. And it's never easy to withdraw these things, but it's probably the right time to sort of wean the market off that subsidy. It's quite a modest subsidy anyway. It was only about £1,500, and most new vehicles are financed anyway. So spread across the life of financing, that was a relatively modest amount for a sort of average consumer or buyer. But EV registrations, as you can see, are booming. We're going to see over 400,000 registered this year. At some point this year, so probably about September time, we will see the 1 millionth electric vehicle registered in the UK. That's light duty vehicles, so cars and vans. And obviously that's a big milestone, getting the 1 millionth vehicle. But you'll see quite quickly there that we'll reach the 2 millionth sometime in 2024. So it's a really sort of rapid trajectory now that the market is beginning that hockey stick style of growth. And when it comes to the type of vehicles that are being registered, what we're seeing now is it's a massive growth in pure electric vehicles, so pure EVs, and PHEVs or plug-in hybrid vehicles are still growing to an extent, but we haven't seen them grow quite as much in recent years. So they are growing year on year with a little bit of sort of flexibility there, mostly due to supply chain issues in the automotive sector not helping, affecting pure electric vehicles slightly less. But you can see the massive growth there in all types of electric vehicle, with pure electrics being the key thing. And that's important for what I'll come on to, because obviously if you've got a pure electric vehicle, it just highlights the importance of electricity and charging it. Whereas obviously if you have a plug-in hybrid, you will vary between those two fuel sources of petrol, diesel and electricity. But if you've got pure electric vehicles in the ascendancy, there really is going to be a focus on sort of batteries, charging, and how to use electricity specifically in the smartest possible way. So again, wider market context. Again, I don't need to tell any of you this, particularly those that are driving petrol diesel cars, but the fuel price in the UK for transport have clearly shot up tremendously in the last sort of year or so. We're now sort of close to sort of £2 a litre. We're well over the £10 sort of gallon. And the average tank, we've been told now by organisations like the AA, the average tank of a family car is now well over £100 to fill up. So there's incredible pressure on people to think about how they can reduce their running cost of their transport, their vehicles, and obviously electric vehicles are one way of doing that. Wider costs, obviously, for consumers are also shooting up. So we're seeing, inflation levels that we haven't seen since the 1980s. So it's a tremendous time for consumers to think about saving money, how to conserve energy, how to conserve their outgoing costs, and so on, both in transport and in their home. So there's lots of these competing pressures on consumers at the moment about how to react to that and how to actually sort of become energy independent or more energy independent, and not have to necessarily be subjected to the incredible rises we've seen, both in terms of fuel for vehicles, but also fuel for homes, so gas and electricity for your home as well, from the grid, which is increasingly expensive. So where do we start? And obviously, all consumers will potentially come at decarbonisation from a different angle. So some people may already have solar. For example, solar panels on their roof. They may not have an electric car, but they may have solar panels. But what we're typically seeing is a sort of electric vehicle being the gateway, the starting point for a lot of consumers into saving energy. They're very prominent now. As I say, we're about to get the millionth electric car on the road. We've already got about 1.5 million homes in the UK with solar panels. So at some point, we expect the number of electric cars to sort of overtake the number of homes with solar panels, and they'll both be rising at a significant rate. But where we start in our sort of ecosystem, we talk a lot in myenergi about the ecosystem of the home, because it's not about a singular product; it's about knitting them all together and creating an ecosystem that really delivers for the consumer. We start at this point where this is your average sort of UK household today. I've obviously blanked out quite a lot of the consumers of electricity or power in the home, but you've got your incoming supply through your electricity meter to your consumer unit. And the thing I'll draw out for reasons that will become obvious is a hot water cylinder. And I'll show you sort of a bit more about how we expand on that. But that's your typical UK home at the moment. Most people do not have an electric car today. Most people do not have solar panels today, but we obviously see that changing at pace. So do you rely on a petrol diesel car, as the icon on the sort of the middle of the screen at the bottom there shows. Now, the first thing we think a lot of consumers will do is, as I say, switch to an electric vehicle. Now, if you're switching to an electric vehicle, the chances are that you will have access to off-street parking at home. That may not be true for everyone, of course, but the majority, just about, of homes in the UK, we think, have some form of off-street parking. There's about 40% that don't, and it's really important that those drives are supported with really good access to public charging infrastructure and so on, charging at work in other places. But for those people that can charge at home, they will inevitably get a home charge point. And our version of that is called the Zappy. So you'll inevitably get a home charge point if you buy an electric car and have access to off-street parking. So that connects up to your consumer unit. So you're starting to consume power that you otherwise you're taking from the grid, and it's just a consumer of your domestic electricity, just as your hot water cylinder is. So that's just another consumer of electricity. Now, what a lot of consumers, in our view, will start to think about, particularly in the wake of rising energy bills, particularly in the wake of their electricity bills going up and up, is how to actually reduce that. So they're using more electricity, and to give you a sense of how much, the average UK electricity consumption, the average sort of typical household consumption is around about 3,000 kilowatt hours a year, and a typical electric car will almost certainly increase that by at least 50%. Maybe 100%. So some electric cars will need about 3,000 kilowatt hours a year to run. That's about 10,000 miles. But if you do a bit less than that, you'll at least go more than 50% of your bill. So it's a significant increase in your electricity bill if you're drawing all that energy from the grid. So a lot of consumers will think about the ways that they can generate power, in our view, rather than just bringing all of that excess from in additional power they need from the grid. So the next logical step in what we see as the growing ecosystem would be for a consumer to get some solar panels. And obviously you've got the ancillary devices there, but you've got your solar panels then feeding into your consumer unit, and actually then you're being somewhat self-sufficient. So you're able to generate some solar power. You can send some of that to the charge point. You could send some of that to your hot water cylinder, but ultimately it will supply your home. And when you're consuming energy, if there's solar being generated, you will obviously be able to benefit from the solar that's being generated. If there isn't any generated, clearly you'll be drawing off the grid. But obviously, in terms of maximizing that solar energy, you really want to be able to use it when, or if you like, consume the energy when you otherwise might not think you need it. So a typical example of that is a hot water cylinder, where most people like hot water most of the time, and you need it at certain times of the day. You might, if you don't have any kind of smart devices, you might just be heating your water maybe once or twice a day at specific times. If those times aren't when your solar energy is being generated, you're not able to benefit from that solar power. Now, if you have a device like the Eddy, which is a solar diverter, you can then maximize the use of that solar by intelligently realizing it can uses the current transformers, the CT clamps, which are the blue lines there, to sense when there is effectively excess solar being generated, to sense when the home is not consuming energy, but there is solar available, and it uses that, diverts that solar for good use, for helpful uses. So the best thing in this example is obviously it's heating your hot water, so less reliant on the grid for your hot water, for the energy to heat your hot water tank. So it's using that to power the hot water, but it could equally send that excess solar to the car, for example. So if your car is plugged in, it might be that you didn't necessarily need to charge your car, but if there's excess solar there, you might as well take it, because otherwise you're going to be drawing that energy off the grid or a public charge point and somewhere else that's going to cost you money. Whereas obviously if you've got your solar panels installed already, you're effectively drawing energy from the sun for free at that point, if you've already paid for them. So that's a great device to be able to divert and maximize your micro generation. So solar is the example here, but it could equally be wind energy, for example. So that's the kind of next step as we see it in the ecosystem, that a consumer might get an electric car, think about generating power themselves through solar, and then want to maximize that solar energy and get a solar diverter to make sure they can actually prioritize the loads, prioritize where the solar is going, and how it's being used in the home to best effect. So making your self-consumption number go up. So you generate, typically as a consumer with solar panels, you generate a lot more solar than you actually use, because obviously a lot of the time it's being generated, you don't need it, and therefore it's effectively going to waste. So it's being exported at negligible value. And effectively you're sort of wasting that energy because it's being generated on your roof, but you can't use it. So what's next? So what we see as the next thing is potentially getting a battery, so a storage battery, an AC storage battery in the home. And the reason for that is obviously if you're generating solar power at times when you don't necessarily need the energy, need the electricity, storing it is a great way to save it up for future use. And obviously being, again, less reliant on the grid supply and being able to store energy intelligently in your home, use it when you need it, store it up for when you need it, and have a good backup supply as well. So it's a great advantage if you have solar to be able to store it at times when you otherwise don't need it, but you will come to need it later. And obviously once it's stored, again, you're not paying to withdraw it out of the battery. It's your battery. If you own it, you're just drawing it out of the battery at no marginal extra cost. If you can't have wired current transformers, by the way, we have a wireless device called the Harvey, which enables you to wirelessly connect without necessarily hardwiring a current transformer. For example, if you've got a very long run from your consumer unit to your EV charger or a battery, for example, so we can do wireless current sensing as well. So that's really how we see the ecosystem working out. So you go from that very bland original setup where you just have a consumer unit and no additional devices to a really intelligent home system where you've got everything working together, helping you to reduce your energy consumption, decarbonize most importantly, but also become more energy independent and be less reliant on the incoming grid power. So what's next? After you've done all of that as a consumer, what do we think are the logical next steps? Because a lot of people are doing this already. What will they be doing maybe in the next 1 to 5 years? Well, if you look at emissions, because that's a kind of the absolutely critical point here in terms of what we're trying to get rid of. If you look at emissions, these are the annual UK emissions for 2019. And you see there a very big chunk of those is from buildings. I mean, obviously you can slice and dice the data in different ways, but a big chunk is from buildings. And by far and away, the largest chunk of that is heating. So heating is a huge polluter in the UK. It's a huge source of emissions, particularly for the home. So the home is the lion's share of that. So your domestic heating and hot water, so what you do to heat hot water and heat your home is actually worse environmentally. You're typically, as a household in the UK, you're typically emitting more from those two things, heating your home and heating your hot water, than you are from driving your petrol or diesel car. So as well, lots of people are switching to things like electric cars, but actually your heating and hot water is sort of a slightly, it's in the background. You probably don't think about it every day, but it's potentially doing more damage environmentally than driving a petrol or diesel car. So it's almost more of an imperative to get people to think about switching their forms of heating over to lower carbon or decarbonised methods of heating. So heating, electrification of heating is, in our view, very much the kind of next frontier of decarbonisation, after obviously vehicles being a very key, prominent form of decarbonisation that we've seen happen in the last few years. So the image here is your typical kind of setup. So I've stolen this from Electrify Heat, which is a UK campaign for the electrification of heat through things like heat pumps. You've got a heat pump on the wall there. Effectively, it looks a little bit like an air conditioning unit. If most of you have seen those, you might have an electric vehicle, in this case, an electric bike on charge. You've got solar panels on the roof. And effectively, again, you've got the decarbonised electric ecosystem around your home. One of the key questions that comes up, obviously, is: do we really get enough sun in the UK? Isn't solar generation, isn't charging electric cars, isn't that just going to be the preserve of the Baltic states, isn't that going to be preserve of the sort of sunshine states around the Mediterranean? Isn't that going to be somewhere you need to go in south of Spain, south of France to benefit from? Well, actually, we already generate a pretty good amount of sunshine in the UK. We may be known for our wet weather, but in terms of the demand that you might have as a consumer, it's already a very, very satisfactory in terms of what you might need it for. So as an example of that, a 4 kilowatt solar array typically generates about 3,500 kilowatt hours per year. And that's enough to drive more than 10,000 miles in your sort of average electric car. So the average efficiency of an electric car is about 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour. So that will power you more than 10,000 miles, which is more than the UK average. The UK average is now below 8,000 miles a year. So obviously being able, as I said earlier, being able to store, capture and use that solar energy at the right time is key. But we really do think that electric cars are going to be that gateway into broader generation and broader decarbonisation. Another key question, obviously, people have is: isn't there electricity already? Isn't there enough electricity already? So, why should people have to generate their own? Can't we just draw off the grid? Surely we should just be able to rely on the pipes and wires coming into our homes. And one of the key things to observe is this slightly grim or sort of tedious looking graph on screen here is the average UK domestic electricity consumption by half hour period. So this is half hourly settlement type data, and this is the Ofgem medium scenario for domestic electricity consumption. So you see basically here the evening peak. So this is very typical of a UK household, not using a huge amount of electricity, sort of throughout the morning. Might be a bit more during the day for people that are at home, for example, and then you use quite a bit in the evening as we all come home, cook dinner, have the TV on, kettle on, whatever, in the evenings. Now, what's a slight challenge for the grid, and I do say challenge rather than a problem, is that at the moment, current behaviours mean that people are driving electric cars and they're quite often coming home and plugging them in. Particularly if you do have something like solar, you want to have your car plugged in as much as possible, because obviously you're never sure when the sun's going to shine. So actually having the vehicle plugged in means it can intelligently manage all of that for you. So if you plug in, if you have things like schedule set up to charge your car at certain times, that's fine. But if you don't, those cars are going to charge at the same time, roughly at the same period as that evening peak. So if we have a massive electric vehicles charging at exactly the same time, or roughly the same time in the evening, at the same time we're already having our peak electricity demand, a daily electricity demand, that's not great for the grid. We do want to try and smooth that out through things like smart charging, off-peak charging, but clearly a great way to do that is to simply avoid grid use altogether and obviously generate your own. So we see more and more consumers now moving towards self-generation. It's getting cheaper and cheaper to install it as well. So the average cost of a sort of 4 kilowatt array in the UK is around about £5,000 fully installed. If you need to finance that, you could finance that with a 3.5% loan at the moment for about £90 a month. And your electricity bills at the moment, based on the average consumption in the UK, that 2,900 kilowatt hours a year, the average bill at the moment a month is over £80 a month. So potentially you could look at some quite decent offsetting of the £80 a month you're paying electricity versus, say, a £90 a month finance for solar panels on your roof. So the numbers are improving all the time. Solar has gone from being the preserve of the sort of very rich to a much more democratized energy source now. And we only see that going one way. We only see the costs falling and people are able to adopt it in bigger and bigger numbers as we move forward. And obviously legislation coming forward to ensure that we have things like charge points in all new homes for electric vehicles, but also solar panels on new homes as well, to make sure this is even easier and the transition is even easier for consumers. So I guess what does good look like? What's the end game here? Well, a scenario like this, where you have your electric vehicle charging, this is a very sustainable, it's in fact a climate positive, so a passive house development in South Oxfordshire called Springfield Meadows by Greencore, and that's got charge points, but also all the homes have obviously very large solar panels that you can see there, and that's the end game really, is to make sure that we can make homes that are and live lives that are effectively very low carbon, if not net zero carbon, and hopefully even positive, where we're actually producing more energy than we're using. So that's where we really want to try and get to. And as I said, we believe that electric vehicles will be the gateway to that, but consumers will adopt all these other technologies, such as electrification of heat and solar, in much bigger numbers after they've started driving their electric car. Thank you very much.
I really resonate with that presentation, mostly because when I bought an electric car, I basically became more aware of my energy use than ever before, to the point that, I'm turning things off, and because they do consume quite a lot of electricity. So you see your bill go up, but it's not as colossal as maybe, petrol prices at the moment. I can't believe they're as high as they are. I did have one question for you in particular, which is where do you think vehicle to grid technology plays in this scenario of electric vehicles?
So I think one of the key things that the technologies like V2G or vehicle to grid, and we also got things like vehicle to X technologies is really communication and data. So and by communication, I mean the communication between devices. So being able to kind of aggregate those sorts of communication. I think actually the vehicle to grid technologies could play a sort of a sooner role or a quicker role in things like depot charging, commercial based charging arrangements where you have a lot of aggregated demand together. So if you think about, say, a bus depot, electric buses on the market today have sort of 300 to 400 kilowatt hour batteries. So you're talking kind of 4 or 5 Teslas, but probably 5, 6, 7, 8 typical electric cars worth of batteries in them. Yeah. If you've aggregated, say, 50 buses together, you've suddenly got basically huge energy storage capability in one area. That's really interesting if you're someone like a distribution network operator. If you're trying to aggregate demand from a quite sort of ad hoc arrangement of various houses in an area that may or may not have V2G technology, that's slightly harder to do. So I think the quicker win will potentially be those aggregated demand areas where you'll see things like network operators and the energy system operators going after those big clusters of potential energy, potential demand response. But obviously, we know from the smart charging regulations that will be active from the end of this month that all new EV charge points have to be capable of things like demand side response services. So we'll certainly see that in terms of the integration of your charge point with DSR. So ultimately, in our view, it won't affect the consumer. That these services will largely happen in the background. They shouldn't, or they won't disrupt your charging experience. You'll plug in. If you want your car charged in the morning, it'll be charged by the morning. And what it does during the night probably will be of little concern to most consumers. But yeah, I certainly see them having a role.
And we talk about government regulation a lot. Now all new builds have to have electric vehicle charge points. Do you think that we also need to start incentivizing developers to not just install electric vehicle chargers, but also the technologies that obviously will reduce reliance on the grid, such as solar panels on people's roofs? That when I look at new houses, there are so few that actually include technology like that these days. So do you think the government needs to do more to incentivize that?
Yeah, I think it's quite strange that we're talking about things like the end of gas boilers, and yet we're still installing them in new homes. I think we need to have a big think about whether that's the right thing to do, knowing that we're going to have to strip them out at some point. I think where it's possible to do so. I mean, typically when you're building a new property, it's usually the cheapest point to put in these technologies because you're not having to do any disruptive retrofitting. So I think if we can make homes, and an example I gave at the end there of the development we've participated in, if you can do as much as possible at the new build stage to decarbonize their home, to make it as sort of climate positive as the wording is as possible, I think that's the key. So it's clearly the cheapest option at the moment is for someone is probably to put a gas boiler in a home. But whether that's the right option, I think is the key. And if you're able to then market the property at a higher value, if you do put things like a heat pump in there, it mitigates the cost of the developer. But the thing that obviously we care about a lot is the sort of social equity argument that actually what you don't want to do is make housing, which is housing for those that are less well off, more expensive through all these new technologies out of the gate. We've got to build it in a way that bears in mind social equity and doesn't discriminate against those who can't afford access to these new technologies. So that's something that we as myenergi think about a lot, and we hope that government and others are thinking about is how do we democratize and ensure that these technologies, whether it's electric vehicles, solar panels, heat pumps, are able to be adopted by those who do not have £10,000 sat around in a bank account, basically.
And another argument that people are making at the moment is obviously electric vehicles are more expensive than petrol vehicles, despite being cheaper to run. And then you have the cost of installing a charger as well. And obviously the government has started to remove incentives. And I know you said at the beginning that it's probably the right time to remove this incentive of the actual electric car incentive, but also the home charge scheme has also been removed for many households. Do you think that was too soon?
I think the home charge scheme actually, I think was in some ways more important than the plug-in car grant. I think it's a lot cheaper for the government to run the the EV charging home charge scheme grant than the plug-in car grant. You're talking sort of millions rather than 100 million a year. I think it may have been too soon, but I think the key that consumers will see is they'll start to see kind of bundling, financing, and so on that actually will kind of almost blur the cost a little bit, so that if you're a consumer, in the near future you're not going to sort of have to, let's say, find over £1,000 for a charge point. If you don't have £1,000, you're going to be able to access charge point in different ways. You're seeing subscription models come to market. We'll see more financing offered by various companies. So as a consumer, your charge point will probably be financed in a similar way to, say, your mobile phone, right? You'll probably kind of see it on that basis. But with the majority of those stopping, if you like, once you've paid off the charger, having an ongoing subscription for a charger seems slightly odd, given that you won't need to sort of carry on paying for it after it's been paid back.
The other thing I really wanted to get out of you was a lot of people, obviously, we talk a lot about how easy it is to own an electric vehicle these days. But I, from my point of view, I'm talking from a very privileged point of view. I have dedicated off-street parking where I can install a charger. Do you think we're doing enough to help those who don't actually have that sort of setup, who live in apartments or places like that?
I think that definitely more could be done. You've obviously seen a lot in the media about the rising costs of things like public charging. And obviously that's rising because the energy costs those public charging providers are paying are rising. So they're not merely raising their costs, they're doing it because their wholesale costs are rising. I guess there's two observations for me. One is that if you think about the very cheap tariffs that you get as a consumer, those cheap tariffs are typically as a result of energy companies being able to effectively trade and being able to hedge prices. Now, what the current operators of public charging can't do, because none of them are kind of sufficiently big yet, is they can't do things like hedging yet. So you're not seeing anyone get sort of smart about hedging and costs coming down, for example. So once you see that happening, once you see the bigger operators being able to actually trade, particularly hedge prices, lock them in for longer, you might see sort of reduced increases in the price of public charging. And obviously, you've actually got to do quite a lot of public charging before you offset the cost of, say, a home charge, to be fair. So it will balance out a little bit. I think one of the really interesting things that we're looking at, innovations that we're looking at as a potential, is what we call sort of through street charging, where there's a lot of interest in on-street charging, particularly residential on-street charging, where you effectively have a lamppost or a bollard or a sort of a dedicated charge sort of post on your pavement outside your house. But there are a lot of challenges around that aren't talked about enough. There's a huge amount of accessibility challenges. If you talk to charities like Motability and others, there are lots of concerns, actually not just about the drivers of these vehicles, but about pedestrians, about other footway users, wheelchair users that are trying to use the pavements who suddenly can't because there's a new public charge point in the way. So actually on-street charging is not the panacea. I don't think that people might think it is. But things like through-street charging, where potentially you're able to draw a supply from a domestic property, say a terrace property, effectively kind of under or through a pavement without any additional kind of furniture on the actual pavement was quite an interesting idea. So things like gullies and gutter arrangements that places like Oxfordshire Council are looking at, we think are really interesting, because obviously as a consumer you can then control your energy. You've got your own supply. You maybe have solar panels. You can actually you're paying your cost, and actually you'll be able to charge your car off that. So it's kind of the intelligent and sort of less risky way of charging your cars than what some people are doing at the moment, which is sort of slinging the cable across the pavement with a couple of cones in the way to warn people about it, which we don't think is really sustainable.
No. And the other benefit, obviously, of having it connected to your own home is the fact that you can take advantage of time of use tariffs.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which obviously public charging, no matter what time of day you charge, it's the same price.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But yeah, that's all my questions for you today. I will let you get back to the rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Tom.